The courtroom felt like a bruise I could still press my thumb into. Hot fluorescent light dug into my eyes, and the floor smelled faintly of old coffee and the kind of cleaning chemicals that pretend to be fresh. The betrayal cut in the middle of a hearing so clean it was surgical, a sound like a scalpel, when my best friend walked up and took the stand as if he'd been summoned by fate, not by a page. I was 31 then, my hands still young and clumsy from trying to hold together things that had fists and names, and I remember the way the air changed the instant Jason Mitchell started talking. Like someone had opened a trapdoor under my feet and let the room rearrange itself around a lie. Jason's voice was too steady at first, the practiced cadence of someone who'd rehearsed sympathy and timed his sobs. He told a story about a night in our old apartment that never happened, about me losing my temper with Ella in front of him, like he'd been a fly on the ceiling watching a monster be born. He produced edited videos and texts stitched together so neatly they read like a script written to fit a verdict. The judge's pen scratched on paper with a rhythm that sounded to me like a guillotine closing. People shifted in their seats with the thin, nervous sound of a room shedding its skin. Heather Collins sat like a woman attending her own damnation, palms folded and eyes down as if she were keeping vigil for something dead. I mouthed, "What?" at Jason, and he blinked back with a look I'd learned was pure calculation, patient, cold, and absolute. My lawyer, Daniel Price, looked like a man who had bitten down on reality and tasted metal. He was competent, exhausted, and for a moment his face held that math, evidence, witness, narrative that any story becomes when you put numbers and papers around it. He moved like someone colonized by process, doing what he could inside a box that had already been painted with a verdict. My attempts to explain were folded into the smallness of he said, she said, and the judge's expression moved into a kind of polite disgust that felt personal, a slow crease that made me feel for the first time how thin the skin of reputation really is. By noon I had nothing but the clothes on my back and a court order that made me a stranger in my own life. No visitation, no calls, no custody. I walked out of that building carrying a paper that said I was not a fit parent and felt like it had been stapled directly to my chest. Outside, the city screamed like it had never heard me before and wanted me to leave faster. I called Jason that night when the bottle finally started to burn my throat and the world narrowed into two names on a tiny screen. He answered with the easy, soft laugh of a man who had just pulled off a long con and wanted me to know how clever he was. "I've wanted Heather," he said flatly, the sort of sentence that opens like a trapdoor to someone else's life. I could hear Heather in the background, low and amused, as if they were reading a press release together. "He'll never see Ella again," she said plainly, and they took turns tearing me into the shape they wanted. I begged for some adult mercy that wasn't coming. She said they'd been together for years, that they had planned this, that the court case had been the endgame. That call didn't just break me, it rewired my whole sense of cause and effect, turned me into a man who stared at the same sky and couldn't believe it was the same color. I didn't storm back into the courthouse the next day like a character in a bad movie. Instead, I ran. I left the state that month, packed a suitcase with half my dignity and a few shirts, and found a small apartment on the other side of the country where the nights hummed with the sound of a nearby parking lot and low fluorescence. I started a job that let me keep my hands busy and my mouth silent. I learned the weight of a clock in a different time zone. I told myself I wouldn't vanish entirely, that leaving was a strategic retreat and not capitulation. So I mailed things. Holiday cards with my handwriting, small presents, a cheap stuffed animal I wrapped twice so it wouldn't look secondhand, letters folded with excessive care and sealed in an envelope that sometimes had the torn edge of a man who could not stop himself from hoping. Some months I sent letters every time the calendar told me to. Other months I pushed them into a drawer and then stuffed the envelope in my jacket and mailed it on some whim, because hope is an ugly, stubborn animal. I called her number the first night and the second and the third until my phone lit up with 64 missed calls and the battery finally died, and I stared at that blank screen like a man trying to find a memory in a burnt room. For years I imagined the worst, that those meetings with social workers and the stitched videos had rewritten her memory, that the voice in the house that night had taught her to forget me. The thing that kept me alive wasn't some grand belief that she'd remember everything perfectly. It was a tenacious little match, small and stupid, that I would strike in the dark until it caught. The phone rang at 2:03 a.m. and I woke with the hallway of that courtroom still crowding my dream like a bruise that wouldn't stop throbbing when the operator's voice came sharp and paper-thin. "We have a minor listed with your name as the emergency contact." The words folded the room, made my chest hollow and my hands go numb, made the world recalibrate to a single angle of possible luck. They gave me the ER number, an hourglass of silence, and hung up before I could form a question that wasn't already a plea. I drove like a man with his foot welded to the gas, Across two state lines in one long blur, fingers white on the wheel, and a taste of metal in my mouth from adrenaline and the sleep I couldn't find. When I pushed through the hospital doors, the waiting room smelled of antiseptic and fevered coffee, fluorescent lights humming like insects. Heather Collins and Jason Mitchell sat opposite each other as if they were co-conspirators posing for a photograph. Their silence was thick and staged. Heather's face had that bleach-blank look of someone who practices grief as costume, and Jason's jaw had the tired bulge of a man who swallows mistakes to keep them from getting loud. He saw me, and for a second his old shell came through, the kid who smoked behind the baseball dugout and shared fries on Friday nights, and then he rested his hand on Heather's knee with a possessive, awful ease that made bile climb my throat. He started talking before I could, voice sliding into that mocking righteousness he'd perfected over years of practice. "We did what we could," he said, like a man who measures mercy in excuses. Then he offered a confession dressed as a favor, telling the room that he'd kept the letters I'd sent and used them to build a story about me. He said it slow, as if performing charity. A nurse glanced over with professional unease, and I felt the air pull tight like string. Behind a thin curtain came the small, cracked sound of a name that dropped into the middle of my chest like a coin. "Dad," Ella whispered, and the hospital's white light split into two halves, one that belonged to the past and one that suddenly opened up. She lay on a narrow bed with a cast on her arm and a bandage at her temple, a fleece blanket pulled up to her chin that smelled faintly of lemon soap and the kind of stains only kids make. Her hair had grown long and stubborn, the same sweep Heather used to scold, and there was a brown stubbornness in her eyes that left no doubt about where she belonged. I moved down to her side slowly, careful on a wire, careful not to jostle the IV or a brittle moment. The nurse hovered, clipboard held like a small shield, and told me the hospital rules about immediate family and privacy with the flat, polite authority of someone who sees 100 crises and keeps each one ordered. When I said her name and showed my ID, the nurse processed it with the calm, clerical voice of someone checking a reservation. The room watched like an audience at a private play, every face ready to choose a role. Heather's mouth thinned into something vile and practiced when the nurse said Ella had requested time alone with me. Jason's smile peeled away from his face like wallpaper. Natalie Brooks arrived with that soft authority people learn when they handle trauma for a living, no drama, just a steady inventory of questions about how long I'd been out of the picture, about visitation history, about letters. She wrote efficiently, fingers tapping. The small things she asked about felt huge. Had I mailed cards? Had I called? Had I tried to show up? I answered as plainly as I could, each sentence a footprint in new ground. Jason watched me as if I'd be caught in a cheap lie. He had no idea that for 8 years I'd kept striking matches in the dark, mailing folded letters with my handwriting and torn sealed edges, trying to leave breadcrumbs for a daughter the court said was not mine to find. The monitors beeped like a nervous metronome, and I sat with that sound in my ears, feeling every missed holiday and every folded page like a new muscle in my chest. For the first time in 8 years, the possibility of being here again wasn't some desperate fantasy. It was a thin, terrifying bridge I could step onto. I kept my hands open and my voice steady, and let the room's loud shame and secret calculations dance around me while I listened for the small, stubborn truth that had just spoken my name. The ER smelled like lemon disinfectant and old paper that had been shut up for years, and Ella's cast scraped quietly against the vinyl as I sat down beside her like a man trying not to wake a sleeping animal. Her arm was wrapped in plaster too big for the thinness of her forearm, the cast carrying a faint grit like road dust, and the bandage at her temple still held a sterile, sharp smell that made the back of my throat ache with worry. She blinked at me, bewildered and light, and when she said my name again, there was a laugh tangled in it that sounded both shocked and relieved, like a key that somehow still turned in a lock. Heather barged back in with a nurse attached as if she were escorting a scene change, the kind of move that smelled of rehearsed control, and she planted herself between us like stage furniture. "You shouldn't be here," she said to the nurse, the words a practiced drop to gather an audience. I slid my driver's license across Ella's bedside tray without a fight, letting the plastic clink speak for me. It read my name plainly, and it mattered like a small, flat miracle. I told the nurse about the attic, how Ella had found a box of letters and memorized my number from the inside of my handwriting. It felt out loud like setting down a heavy thing I had carried under my shirt for years. Dr. Alan Green came in with steady steps and a coat that had lived in many rooms like this, and he did the sober, necessary work of measuring harm. He explained concussions and broken bones in clean sentences, tapping his pen as if tallying offenses. He noted bruises that didn't match the pattern of a crash and asked gentle, sharp questions about prior incidents, about how often she'd been grabbed or slammed. Ella's voice trembled when she answered, small and honest like a child reading a confession from memory, and the doctor wrote each line with a focus that felt almost like worshipful care. He told me plainly that the ambulance toxicology showed Ethan Parker's blood alcohol at 0.14, not the kind of number that invites explanations. Natalie Brooks arrived and sat with us, not like a visitor but like someone whose job was to hold pieces together. She asked about safety plans and recorded how Ella had hidden letters and photos in an attic where she thought no one would find them. The attic image landed heavy and warm in my chest. A ladder, a single bulb, dust motes the size of planets, and a cardboard shoebox with my name written on envelopes in a hand that had grown shaky but real. Ella told us Chloe Ramirez from her art class had kept the letters safe, not because they were proof of me, but because Chloe had the kind of courage that doesn't go looking for praise. I called Chloe from the pay phone outside, the receiver cold and familiar, and her voice on the other end was young and steady in a way that surprised me. She told me where the house sat, the crooked porch and the neighbor's barking dog, and she said she would meet me in her garage. I could hear through the static and the hum of the hospital that she was breathing fast. When Chloe met me, she had a plaster smudge on her elbow and the kind of look you get when you're carrying something dangerous and beautiful at once. We climbed an attic ladder older than either of us, and the moment the lid lifted, the light hit us like a reveal. The attic smelled exactly like the inside of a book that had been left in a closet, must and paper and sun that had once warmed it. The shoebox was there under a moth-eaten sweater taped with yellowed masking tape. I slid my hand under the lid and the envelopes rustled like small betrayals. There were hundreds, or it felt that way, stack upon stack, stamps faded, edges torn where hands had tried to hide and then reopen memory. I cut my finger on an edge and the sting was ridiculous. A bright paper cut that bled and made me gasp. The sting felt honest in a way tears never did. Inside one envelope unopened, my name in my own hand sat like a test. My throat constricted. Chloe watched me with the fierce, unblinking patience of a kid who had kept a secret dangerous enough to cost her friends. Holding those letters, smelling their old paper, and seeing the dates in a line across years I had spent aching, the world snapped into a shape I had only dared imagine. These were not just words, they were a ledger, proof I had been trying, fumbling, loving. I folded them against my chest like armor and thought about what we had to do next. Call Natalie, let Dr. Green add them to the chart, take photographs, make copies, bring them into light where lies could not live comfortably. The attic dust settled on my jeans and in my mouth, and when I climbed back down, I felt both lighter and more exposed than I had in years. The hospital smelled like bleach and machines and the hollow of a building that keeps secrets, and I found a quiet corner and called Chloe because her number was a prayer I had repeated in my head for days, and left a voice message that sounded more like a plea than a request until she answered on the second ring with the small, steady voice of someone who had learned to be brave fast. Mr. Carter, it's Chloe. Ella gave me your number. I'm at home with Mrs. Ramirez, she said, and the words made a map rearrange under my feet like a floor shifting in an earthquake. I told Daniel Price the bare facts over a phone that felt too small for the news. Hospital, concussion, bruises that didn't fit a crash, Chloe with a shoebox full of letters. His voice went low and clinical with focus, the way a surgeon's does before cutting. Don't say anything publicly, he warned, and then he outlined a list that felt like a weapon. Photograph everything, get sworn statements from Chloe and the nurses, document the hospital records, add the toxicology report to the file. His calm made the plan feel possible. He told me CPS would take the lead, but insisted we bring receipts and a chain of custody for the paper evidence. I wrote down each step like stitching a wound closed. The police came that afternoon, Officer Morales with a uniform that sat easy on him because he'd seen families fall apart 50 ways and learned good questions that didn't make things worse. He had a slow, steady manner as he asked me to write everything I knew about the old custody fight. My handwriting looked like a man's pulling himself back together. A page filled with dates, names, and the odd phrase that didn't belong in a painstaking inventory. Chloe texted me from the ER. A photo of a shoebox lid with my handwriting, the flap curling like a secret exposed. That image kept me moving. I climbed into my car and drove 4 blocks back toward a part of town I had barely let myself remember. Chloe's kitchen smelled like cinnamon and warm laundry. Sunlight cut across the table where Mrs. Ramirez sat with a tired, frank face that broadcast experience. She watched me without a headline, her eyes quiet as a judge's. Mrs. Ramirez said softly that they hadn't wanted to get involved because loyalty can cost children a world, and because sometimes silence looks safer than truth. Chloe handed me the envelopes like an offering, and I felt small and enormous at once as I took them into my hands. There were birthday cards with sticky crayon inside, messy drawings folded into thirds, Letters with stamps matching months I'd sent things and the slow ink of a man who tried not to die inside. I opened one with hands that trembled despite everything, and the paper smelled like home and old pizza and stubborn people. My hands shook so badly I set it down twice, and cut a tiny paper nick into my thumb that stung exactly the way honesty can, a clean pain. Chloe agreed to write a sworn affidavit that evening, and watched me sign a chain of custody form like someone who understood the difference between proof and hope. She was 15 but had learned to be an adult faster than most kids, and her voice did not quaver when she said she had kept the letters because Ella was scared the adults would use them. That night Heather called and her voice slithered syrupy with panic and fake remorse. "You shouldn't be here, Noah," she said, acting like a woman who wanted to negotiate a story rather than face consequences, and then she offered a version of calm that smelled like threat. I did not yell. I forwarded the photographs of the envelopes to Daniel and to Officer Morales, and I sent Chloe's affidavit to Natalie Brooks at CPS. The law runs on receipts and sworn papers, and I would not hand my daughter's life back to smoke and rumor. The receipts were small and ordinary: stamps, postmarks, dates, a shoebox lid marked with my handwriting like a compass. I felt a fevered kind of relief then, the kind that comes from lighting a path through a dark house. The week that followed hit like a fist, a teeth-grinding blur of legal meetings, hospital interviews, and late-night threats that smelled of beer and old confidence, and I learned very quickly that anger makes a noise that keeps you awake. Ethan Parker, the man who'd moved into my life and then into my daughter's, left 3 vicious voice memos on my phone that a prosecutor later saved to a file, each one sloshing with that same hillside bravado he wore like cologne. "You don't come around here and rewrite history," one of them said in a slow, thin voice that tried to sound like warning and promise at once, and I replayed it until the edges of the words blurred and began to look like a list of crimes. Heather filed an emergency petition that smelled like a tactic: claim manipulation, claim instability, claim my return would harm Ella, and use the old custody file like evidence of inevitability. Daniel Price didn't blink. He moved fast and clean the way I always hoped a man could move when he had to pick up the pieces someone else threw down. He filed a response attaching Chloe's sworn affidavit, the photographs of the letters, the hospital records showing bruises inconsistent with a simple car crash, and the toxicology report that put Ethan at 0.1 for the night of the accident. Those pieces stacked like weights and began to change the room from rumor into something that could be read. CPS took the lead with the weary, bureaucratic gentleness of people who see danger and know how to turn it into process, and Natalie Brooks recommended temporary placement consideration while investigations continued, which felt like a small rescue. I slept in a sterile hotel 2 blocks from Ella's school because being near felt like doing something practical against a world that had been practical in hurting us. The hotel smelled like the quiet despair of people between points, disinfectant, and cheap coffee, and I bought a cheap comforter and a set of towels that Ella could call hers so she wouldn't have to carry someone else's scent into a new bed. Each morning I made the bed like a ritual and ironed a shirt like a flag. Then came the hallway day that looked like every old movie I'd tried to pretend I didn't belong in. I was walking out of the hospital with a stack of forms when Ethan stepped in front of me, big and sure, as if the world should rearrange itself around his threats. He carried that new thickness, the wideness of a man who sleeps well and loses tenderness, and he said, low and dangerous, "Don't get used to it. Call one thing in wrong and we'll make sure you never see her again." The security guard watched from a distance with the polite interest of someone who doesn't want to be involved, and Ethan put his hand on my chest in a possessive claim on the space I needed to breathe. I had a single bright thought of swinging, of making a clean, stupid act that would give them everything they'd painted me to be, and then I thought of Ella in a bed with a bandage in her hair, and I put my phone to my pocket and hit record. I walked away and recorded the whole thing instead of answering with fists. The next morning, Heather sent a text that was all crocodile remorse and pleading, and Daniel responded through legal channels with a calm that felt like a blade: evidence, procedure, motion. The hearing was scheduled for the following week, and we prepared like people who have been given a second chance and are trying not to ruin it. Chloe's affidavit was notarized and sworn. Natalie had compiled notes that read like a ledger of neglect. Dr. Alan Green's records were crisp and clinical, and the shoebox of letters had been photographed, cataloged, and copied into exhibits that smelled faintly of old paper and stubborn faith. The stage was set. All that was left was to stand in front of Judge Whitman and tell the truth with my hands empty and my voice full. Courtroom mornings are cold for the bones, like someone left the building's windows open on purpose, and the air inside sharpened everything it touched, and the smell of old wood and lemon oil felt like a history book rubbed raw. The courthouse looked the same from the outside, but inside the furniture seemed rearranged, as if the room had been waiting for a different act to begin. People who'd never met me sat in the gallery as if they were there for sport, and their whispers felt like a tide that could either lift me or drown me. I walked in with Daniel Price, a man who moves like a surgeon when he has to, and the folder under his arm was thick with the things we had gathered: letters, affidavits, hospital notes, the physical weights of proof. Heather and Ethan sat with their attorney looking practiced and whole, the kind of people comfort makes soft and the kind of liars that practice their faces until they pass for truth. And Chloe Ramirez sat in the front row like a small but immovable pillar with a backpack at her feet and a notebook in her lap. Dr. Alan Green's affidavit was there, clinical and precise, and Natalie Brooks' notes looked like a blueprint to safety. The nurse who had first seen Ella signed a statement that read like a witness to a body telling the truth, and piles of my letters, their edges torn, stamps faded, the envelopes creased with years of hope, were entered as exhibits that smelled faintly of the attic where they'd been kept safe. The defense opened on a script I'd heard before: a father who reappears after 8 years, a traumatized child who could be manipulated, a household that needed stability. They made it sound like a public service announcement, clean and careful and aimed at a judge's reasonable heart. The prosecutor's bench watched, the judge tapped his pen like a metronome, and the courtroom hummed. Then Daniel stood and moved through our evidence with a kind of brutal efficiency that made people stop doodling on their pads and forced the room to pay attention. He played the hospital audio notes, the ambulance toxicology readout, and then he asked Chloe to take the stand. Chloe spoke like someone who had swallowed courage and grown around it. She described the shoebox, the dates on stamps, the way Ella had begged her to keep the letters because she was afraid they'd be used against her. She described bringing the box to me and swearing to tell the truth, and every time she said a detail, the room felt smaller, like a net tightening around a lie. Daniel then asked Ella, directly and calmly, if she had put my number on her emergency contact list herself, and she nodded the way a small person can answer the world: straightforward, surprising, and final. The defense called witnesses who tried to spin the bruises as teenage scrapes and explain the gaps with therapy jargon, but the thread of evidence began to twist into something real. Injuries inconsistent with a simple car accident, a driver's blood alcohol over the legal limit, stacks of letters proving ongoing contact. And then Ethan snapped in a way that made the chamber hold its breath, the way a crowd leans forward before a punch lands. It didn't happen slowly like the movies. It happened like a pressure valve popping after too much wind. He'd been coached to keep calm, and his attorney had tried to steady him, but Daniel asked about specifics from the old trial, and something lodged in him. He rose, voice shaking at first, then thick with liquor and something like panic, and he said the words that made the air change color: that they'd helped Heather's case the first time, that they had enhanced stories to make custody tilt their way. The words were clumsy, ugly, and then rock solid because he had said them in court under oath. His lawyer slapped a hand over his face in a way that said, "Too late." Heather's expression flicked from shock to calculation in a single heartbeat. Judge Whitman leaned forward like a man who had been waiting for the scales to balance, and then found the weight suddenly present. He called for decorum, but the order in the room felt like the end of a lie. He denied the emergency petition to return Ella to Heather and Ethan, and he ordered that Ella stay in temporary placement with me while the criminal and CPS referrals were investigated further. He read the room with a kind of merciful precision, and then referred the matter to the district attorney to review possible perjury and child endangerment charges. The gavel didn't crash like a judge in a movie flinging down justice. It fell with the sober sound of a hinge closing on a long festering wound. I left the courtroom tired and strange, my legs carrying me like a man who just climbed a hill only to see another ridge ahead, and the crowd's eyes tracked me like I was a story they wanted to believe in or deny. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt like a man who had been given a map back and had to learn the roads all over again, careful and clumsy and alive. The truth had finally threaded a path through years of smoke, but the hard work of living with it, of building days that don't require court filings to make them exist, was only beginning. The first morning after the hearing felt like standing on the lip of a pool I hadn't trusted for years, and I dove into work the way you dive when you finally choose to live. Head first, breath held, then slow breaths once under the surface. The weeks that followed were all paperwork and small, concrete things that felt like repair by accumulation. Therapist numbers, school enrollment forms, fingerprint-based background checks, and a CPS home study that required me to show photos of every room and a list of every person who would have access to Ella. I painted her room a soft gray-green she picked, and the fumes of the paint mixed with the hospital scent that sat stubbornly in my chest. a strange perfume for new beginnings. We ate pancakes at a diner that smelled of butter and coffee and jukebox songs from the 70s. And for the first 5 minutes, I watched Ella pick the syrup like someone rediscovering sweetness after a long fast. We did the ordinary chores people think of when they say getting your life back, dentist appointments that made her flinch at the sound of the drill, immunizations that made us grimace and then laugh in the car, online school registration that felt like filling out a life on paper. But the real repair came in smaller acts. We learned how to make a bed that stayed made, how to load a dishwasher without arguing about spoons, how to choose movies that didn't reopen wounds, and how to carve out time for homework and time for talk that wasn't about courtrooms. Ella started seeing a counselor who smelled faintly of citrus and had a voice that didn't rush, and the counselor gave words to the little violences she'd been taught to call normal, the jokes that grew sharp, the hands that grabbed harder than necessary. Chloe came over with a casserole that still smelled like cumin and her mother's hands, and the two of them sat on the couch painting a calendar for homework and visits like settlers mapping a new life. The small rituals added up. A toothbrush bought at a drugstore, a new comforter pulled tight, a lamp with a soft bulb that made late-night reading habit instead of fear. At night, we'd read things out loud, a bad poem, the news, the back of a cereal box, and the ordinary sound of nonsense built a cathedral of safety. The law continued its slow grind. The district attorney opened a case against Ethan for child endangerment and related counts, and he first fought hard in the way privileged men do, then took a plea that included probation and community service that felt like accountability without spectacle. It wasn't revenge. It was the legal system marking a wrong and demanding a thin, formal amends. Heather filed for divorce from Ethan shortly after, and the way she apologized to me felt like someone learning to swim in cold water, shocked at how deep it was and struggling just to keep her head above. She asked if Ella could have supervised visits. I didn't say yes right away. I talked with Ella and the counselor and felt my answer land as a decision we made together rather than a concession to anyone's comfort. I tried to make sure Chloe never felt like a prop in the story we were building. I wired a small college fund into Mrs. Ramirez's account and gave Chloe a camera with a strap that said keep this safe, because she had protected more than paper, she had protected a girl's memory. Daniel filed motions to seal records and protect Ella's privacy in a way that looked like armor, and we set up a small trust for therapy and for the quiet costs of moving a teenager's life into a new district. Friends showed up with things that mattered, a couch donated, boxes moved in a badly timed rainstorm, late-night tacos that tasted like mercy. A neighbor brought lasagna that smelled like Sunday and stayed a friend because she didn't expect anything back. We did the small social stuff that stitches a life. Registering at a new school, finding a barista who remembered Ella's order, decaf with oat milk and 2 packets of sugar, please, and a mailman who smiled like he actually liked his job. Nights became less like watches for ambush and more like slow breathing. I slept more than 2 hours at a stretch for the first time in forever. The old anger sat like a weathered coat on a chair in the corner. It was still there, folded and heavy, but it no longer had me by the throat. Healing, I learned, doesn't look cinematic. It looks like grocery lists, like a shy apology accepted and then tested, like both of us learning to argue about dishwashers instead of rights and wrongs. The messy, imperfect days quietly piled into something that looked like a real life. And every night when Ella shut her door and I could hear the house settle around us, I felt a small, stubborn kind of peace. We didn't get the years back, but we built a room where the future could live, slow and stubborn and honest, and sometimes that's all courage needs, not a headline, but a lamp left on until the dark goes away. The dining table looked like a crime scene and a shrine at once, strewn with photos that had edges softened by fingers and time, ticket stubs creased from pockets, a birthday candle half melted and placed carefully in the center like evidence and antidote, the shoebox of letters I had written. 6 months after the hearing, she started the school project she called What Is Missing, and she spread the pieces out with a kind of careful hunger that made my chest hurt in a way I couldn't fix with a lawsuit or a speech. The shoebox smelled faintly of dust and stamps and attic sun. When she opened it, the envelopes rustled like a chorus, and the room filled with the sound of my past asking for a future. Ella arranged everything chronologically and stepped back to study the gaps with a look I knew too well, the face of someone counting what the world took. There was a clean break where a stack of photos thinned out and then picked back up again. Those absent years were a white space on the table that made the rest of the artifacts seem sharper. The project name What Is Missing felt like a dare and a kindness at once, and when she put a dated Polaroid of us at the zoo next to a ticket stub from a movie we never finished, something in my ribs unclenched a fraction. The timeline smelled like glue sticks and old paper, and someone had stuck a tiny crooked label in the corner that read June when letters started. Chloe came over with a roll of tape and the easy grin of someone who'd kept secrets until they weren't secret. We took small trips that felt indulgent because they were small and simple. A cheap motel by a lake where the shower head fought for water and the view was a false postcard of quiet. An afternoon at an art store where Ella chose paintbrushes like gifts, fingers stained with pigment by the time we left. Sundays making pancakes with too much sugar and laughter that kept stopping us both by surprise. She reconnected with friends. Chloe and Ella planned a photo series about nights in backyards and the way teen life looks when you can smell spring. Heather came for supervised visits, awkward and sharp with apology that wanted to be a rope back but could only be a single thread. "I was scared of losing everything," Heather said once, voice small and honest in a way that hurt because she sounded like a woman meeting herself in a mirror. Ella listened and then chose what she wanted for contact, and that choice landed like a small, decisive sentence on the table between us. A year after the hospital, the judge made the final ruling, permanent custody granted, final and practical. It was not dramatic. The law is a blunt tool that measures risk and safety better than it measures rightness. Ethan took a plea, probation, and community service, which made headlines smaller and the harm clearer, and the district attorney said the state's work is often to stop harm rather than make theater. We marked the ruling with a camera lens for Ella's photography club and a cake that had too much frosting, and Chloe and her mother sat on our couch with mashed potatoes and conversation that didn't need to be careful. Ella taped a strip of the timeline to the living room wall and with typical teenage fatalism titled the project in a new hand. "Sometimes the missing comes back." She left a blank line at the end and wrote in a different pen, "For the person who kept writing." I kept the letters in the shoebox in the closet like relics and receipts both, proof that I had not stopped reaching. Sometimes I would take one out and read a sentence, and the paper would smell like stamps and old coffee and an ache that was nearly holy. I pressed a page to my face once and felt the ghost of a life I had missed more acutely than any court could account for. The small rituals of repair, buying a toothbrush, showing up for school pickup, arguing over what counts as a healthy dinner, became the stitches that held us. The best moments were tiny. The clack of a camera shutter from the next room, the smell of burnt toast, a homework sheet slid across the table with a penciled-in question about algebra that made both of us laugh because numbers can be simple when the heart is complicated. At night, I sometimes find myself at the window watching the streetlight carve a rectangle on the floor and thinking about how change doesn't roar so much as nudge. Ella will be older soon and will have choices I can't make for her, and that terrifies me in a way that is honest. For the years we have now, we are together. Past wrongs still have teeth, but they no longer decide dinner or bedtime. We fill the gaps with ordinary things, a lamp left on, a camera lens polished, coffee shared on a Saturday morning, and those small choices amount to a life. When I tuck her in now, she reaches for my hand with a trust that still tests me sometimes, the way small people check horizons to see if they'll disappear. "Don't leave," she whispers some nights, the same 2 words she said the first time she wrote my number in an envelope and hid it in a shoebox. I press my thumb over hers, smell the faint scent of sleep and shampoo and something stubbornly domestic, and I say simply what I've always meant but never had paper to prove. I won't. We both know that promises are not magic, they are work. So we keep the box in the closet, we leave the light on in the hall, and we do the long, unglamorous job of staying. The timeline hangs on the wall, a photo pinned to the middle, and every time I pass it I see the open shoebox and remember that a man kept writing until the missing could be found.